December 19, 1941. The Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. Adolf Hitler sat at his desk in the concrete bunker that served as his military headquarters, reading yet another report from the Eastern Front. The news was uniformly catastrophic. Army Group Center, which had been within sight of Moscow's spires 3 weeks earlier, was in full retreat. Soviet counteroffensives were breaking through German lines. Temperatures had dropped to minus 40 degrees. Equipment was failing. Men were freezing. The blitzkrieg that was supposed to end in triumph was collapsing in the Russian winter. For months, Hitler's generals had been requesting permission to retreat, to withdraw to defensible lines, to preserve the army for spring operations. Each request was denied. Hitler demanded every meter of ground be held. No retreats, no withdrawals, stand and fight or die in place. The orders were tactically insane and strategically suicidal. German commanders knew it. They sent increasingly desperate pleas explaining that holding was impossible, that entire armies faced encirclement and destruction. Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the German army, had just submitted his resignation. The strain of commanding an army group that was disintegrating, while the supreme commander refused to permit any rational response, had broken him. He was 60 years old, suffering heart problems, and could no longer function under the stress. His resignation gave Hitler an opportunity he had wanted for years. Hitler picked up his pen and wrote the order that would change how Germany prosecuted the war. He would not appoint a replacement for Brauchitsch. Instead, Hitler himself would assume direct command of the German army. The head of state, the political leader of Nazi Germany, would personally command military operations. No modern nation had attempted such concentration of power. No professional military had accepted political micromanagement at this level, but Germany would. And the decision made on December 19, 1941, would determine how Germany fought for the rest of the war. This is the story of the day Hitler seized total military control. How the disaster before Moscow enabled a power grab that the Wehrmacht never recovered from. How professional military judgment was subordinated to ideological fanaticism. And how one man's refusal to accept reality doomed millions of German soldiers to death in a war that became unwinnable the moment he took command. To understand December 19, 1941, you must understand the relationship between Hitler and his generals from the beginning. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Germany's military was constrained by the Treaty of Versailles. The army was limited to 100,000 men. Tanks, aircraft, submarines, and heavy artillery were forbidden. The officer corps, drawn from traditional Prussian military families, viewed Hitler with suspicion. He was a former corporal, an Austrian, a populist who had never attended military academy. To career officers, he was an upstart. But Hitler offered something the military desperately wanted: rearmament. He promised to rebuild Germany's armed forces, to restore military prestige, to undo the humiliations of Versailles. The generals made their Faustian bargain. They would accept Hitler's political leadership in exchange for military expansion. The arrangement seemed manageable. Hitler would handle politics. The professionals would handle military matters. This division of responsibilities seemed clear. The relationship was tested during the reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936. Military advisors warned Hitler that France might respond with force, and Germany couldn't resist. Hitler ordered the operation anyway. France did nothing. The generals learned that Hitler's political instincts could be more accurate than their military caution. The lesson was dangerous. It established a pattern where Hitler's gambles paid off and military professionalism seemed timid. Austria's annexation in 1938 followed the same pattern. The generals warned of risks. Hitler acted. Success followed. The Sudetenland crisis, the occupation of Czechoslovakia, each time military caution proved unnecessary. Hitler's confidence grew. He began viewing professional military advice as excessive caution from men who didn't understand modern warfare or political will. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 was different. This time, military action triggered the war Hitler's generals had feared. Britain and France declared war, but the Wehrmacht crushed Poland in weeks. The generals' warnings about Germany's vulnerability to two-front war seemed premature. Yes, Britain and France were now enemies, but they weren't fighting. The phony war suggested they lacked will to act. The planning for the invasion of France in 1940 brought Hitler and his generals into direct conflict. The General Staff proposed a conventional plan, attacking through Belgium as in 1914. Hitler, influenced by General Erich von Manstein, demanded a more audacious approach: punch through the Ardennes, cut off Allied forces, and win decisive victory. Military professionals considered the Ardennes unsuitable for major armored operations. Hitler ordered it anyway. The result was Germany's most stunning victory. France fell in 6 weeks. The British army evacuated from Dunkirk. Professional military judgment had been wrong. Hitler's instinct had been correct. This success was catastrophic for civil-military relations. Hitler now believed his military genius was superior to professional training. The generals' authority was shattered. When they advised caution, Hitler could point to France and dismiss their concerns. The planning for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, showed this dynamic clearly. The generals proposed focusing on Moscow. Capture the capital, destroy the Soviet government, win the war. Hitler insisted on broader objectives: destroy the Red Army in the field, seize economic resources in Ukraine, capture Leningrad. The debate lasted months. Hitler's view prevailed because he was now making strategic decisions based on ideological and economic factors that professionals didn't fully understand. Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941. Initial success was spectacular. Soviet forces were encircled and destroyed. Millions of prisoners were taken. By September, Army Group Center was approaching Moscow. Victory seemed imminent, but the campaign had deviated from the original schedule. The diversion to Kiev, ordered by Hitler over military objections, had delayed the Moscow offensive by crucial weeks. As autumn turned to winter, the situation deteriorated. Soviet resistance stiffened. The muddy season immobilized German forces. Supply lines stretched to breaking points. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, undersupplied, and inadequately equipped for winter. The generals requested permission to halt offensive operations, consolidate positions, and prepare for winter. Hitler refused. Moscow must be taken. The offensive would continue. The final push toward Moscow began in November. German forces advanced to within 15 miles of the Kremlin. Reconnaissance units could see the city's landmarks through their binoculars, but the advance stalled. Soviet defenses held. The temperature dropped catastrophically. German equipment designed for European warfare failed in Russian winter. Engines wouldn't start. Weapons jammed. Lubricants froze. Men suffered frostbite because winter uniforms hadn't been issued. The logistics system had assumed the campaign would end before winter. On December 5, 1941, the Soviets launched massive counteroffensives north and south of Moscow. Fresh divisions from Siberia, equipped for winter warfare, attacked German positions held by exhausted, frozen troops. The attacks broke through in multiple locations. German units began falling back. The retreat wasn't orderly withdrawal. It was collapse. Units lost cohesion. Equipment was abandoned. Men died from cold as much as combat. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, reported that his forces faced destruction unless permitted to retreat. He requested authorization to fall back to defensible positions, possibly as far as the line they'd held in September. The retreat would surrender hundreds of miles of territory but save the army. Hitler refused. Not one step back. Every position would be held. Any commander who retreated without authorization would be relieved and court-martialed. The order was military insanity. German forces holding indefensible positions while under heavy attack would be encircled and destroyed. Professional military judgment said retreat was essential, but Hitler insisted that holding ground was more important than preserving the army. His reasoning was partially ideological. National Socialist could overcome material disadvantages, and partially practical. If the army retreated, it might not stop. The retreat could become a rout like Napoleon's in 1812. General Heinz Guderian, the pioneer of armored warfare and hero of the French campaign, found himself in impossible positions. His panzer army was scattered across a front too wide to defend. Soviet forces were infiltrating between his units. He ordered tactical retreats to consolidate positions. Hitler discovered this and called Guderian to headquarters for a confrontation. The meeting on December 20th was brutal. Hitler accused Guderian of defeatism. Guderian explained tactical realities. His tanks were immobilized by cold, his men were freezing, his supply lines were cut. Hitler dismissed these concerns. Willpower would overcome material problems. German soldiers were superior to Soviets. Retreat was psychological defeat. Guderian was to hold every position or be relieved of command. Similar scenes were repeated with other commanders. General Erich Hoepner ordered a tactical retreat without authorization and was immediately dismissed from service and stripped of pension rights. Field Marshal von Bock was relieved for requesting withdrawal permissions too insistently. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, commanding Army Group North, requested permission to withdraw from exposed positions around Leningrad. He was dismissed. The purge was comprehensive. But the most significant change came on December 19th with Brauchitsch's resignation. As commander-in-chief of the army, Brauchitsch was the buffer between Hitler and field commanders. He translated Hitler's strategic vision into operational orders. He defended field commanders when their tactical decisions conflicted with Hitler's demands. He was the professional head of the army, responsible for its training, doctrine, and operational effectiveness. Brauchitsch's failure wasn't military incompetence. It was inability to reconcile Hitler's demands with military reality. Hitler insisted on holding every position. Military reality said that was impossible. Brauchitsch couldn't satisfy both requirements. The stress caused his health to collapse. His resignation was partially voluntary, partially forced. Hitler had lost confidence in him. Brauchitsch recognized he no longer had authority to command. When Hitler accepted the resignation and announced he would personally assume command of the army, the decision shocked the military establishment. No modern head of state commanded field armies personally. The job required detailed knowledge of organization, logistics, training, and doctrine. It required understanding capabilities and limitations of hundreds of divisions. It required processing information from multiple fronts and making rapid decisions based on military, not political, considerations. Hitler had none of these qualifications. He had been a corporal in World War I. His military experience was limited to infantry tactics in trench warfare. He had never commanded anything larger than a platoon in combat. He had no staff training. He didn't understand logistics. His knowledge of military operations came from studying maps and reading reports, not from actual command experience. But Hitler believed he possessed something more important than professional training: will. He was convinced that determination, ideological commitment, and refusal to accept defeat could overcome material disadvantages. He viewed professional military officers as too ready to accept limitations. They thought in terms of what was possible given resources and circumstances. Hitler thought in terms of what was necessary to achieve political objectives. This fundamental difference in worldview had existed throughout the war, but Brauchitsch's presence as army commander-in-chief had moderated it. Brauchitsch could reinterpret Hitler's demands into militarily feasible orders. He could delay implementation of impossible demands. He could protect commanders who made tactically sound decisions that contradicted Hitler's orders. With Brauchitsch gone, that buffer disappeared. The immediate effect was apparent in how the Moscow crisis was handled. Professional military advice unanimously recommended strategic retreat, fall back to defensible lines, consolidate forces, rest and refit, resume operations in spring. Hitler rejected this completely. He ordered that every position be held. Commanders who couldn't hold their positions would be relieved. Units that retreated without authorization would face courts-martial. This decision has been debated by historians ever since. Some argue Hitler was correct, that strategic retreat in the Russian winter would have become uncontrollable rout, that holding in place, despite enormous casualties, prevented complete catastrophe, that Hitler's refusal to permit retreat saved the army. This is the interpretation Hitler himself promoted and some German generals accepted post-war. The alternative interpretation is that Hitler's orders caused unnecessary casualties and failed to achieve their stated objective. German forces did retreat despite the orders. They fell back because remaining in place meant being encircled and destroyed. The stands Hitler demanded at tactically insignificant positions consumed units that could have been preserved. The officers dismissed for ordering necessary retreats were vindicated when their replacements ordered identical withdrawals. What's undeniable is that December 19, 1941, marked a fundamental shift in how Germany prosecuted the war. From that date forward, Hitler personally made operational decisions. He decided which cities must be held, which offensives must be launched, which retreats were permitted. Field commanders became executors of his decisions rather than independent operational commanders. The Wehrmacht's traditional mission-type tactics, where subordinate commanders had freedom to achieve objectives using their judgment, was replaced by centralized control, where every significant decision required Hitler's approval. The human cost was immediate. Officers who disagreed with Hitler's orders faced relief, court-martial, or worse. The space for professional military judgment disappeared. Commanders learned that objecting to impossible orders was career-ending. Compliance, even with militarily insane demands, was required. This created a climate where honest assessment was dangerous and optimistic reporting was rewarded. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, became Hitler's primary military assistant. Keitel was competent but weak-willed. He rarely contradicted Hitler and translated the Führer's decisions into orders without protest. Officers derisively called him Lackatel, a pun suggesting he was a lackey. But Keitel survived because he gave Hitler what he wanted, compliance without argument. General Alfred Jodl, chief of operations, was more independent but learned to present options in ways that led Hitler to decisions Jodl favored. This required subtle manipulation and careful timing. Jodl would raise concerns when Hitler was receptive and remain silent when Hitler was dogmatic. It was manipulation masquerading as staff work, necessary because direct disagreement was dangerous. For field commanders, the situation was worse. They dealt with tactical realities Hitler didn't see and couldn't admit. Soviet forces were better equipped for winter warfare. German logistics couldn't maintain armies this far from railheads. Equipment was failing. Men were dying from cold. These weren't problems that willpower could solve, but reporting them honestly meant being accused of defeatism. The solution many commanders adopted was partial compliance. They held positions as long as militarily feasible, then conducted tactical adjustments that were retreats in everything but name. They reported these adjustments in language that minimized their significance. They learned to present operational failures as local setbacks caused by specific circumstances rather than systemic problems. They told Hitler what he wanted to hear while doing what military necessity demanded. This dishonesty had long-term consequences. Hitler's understanding of the military situation was filtered through officers who knew that accurate reporting was punished. He received overly optimistic assessments because pessimistic ones ended careers. This feedback loop meant Hitler's decisions were based on distorted information. He couldn't make sound strategic choices because he didn't know the true situation. The Eastern Front stabilized somewhat by February 1942. German forces had retreated despite Hitler's orders, but the retreat hadn't become a rout. New defensive lines were established. The spring thaw immobilized both sides. There was time to rest, refit, and plan summer operations. Hitler pointed to this outcome as vindication. His refusal to permit retreat had prevented catastrophe. The army had held. But the cost was staggering. German casualties from December 1941 to March 1942 exceeded 900,000. Over 100,000 died from cold alone. Equipment losses were enormous. Thousands of tanks, vehicles, guns abandoned because they couldn't be recovered. Entire divisions were reduced to skeletons. The Wehrmacht's effectiveness was permanently diminished. The army that emerged from the winter was weaker than the one that had entered it. More critically, the command structure was permanently damaged. Hitler's assumption of army command meant every significant operational decision now required his approval. Army group commanders couldn't maneuver their forces without authorization from headquarters hundreds of miles away. Corps commanders needed approval for tactical withdrawals that should have been routine decisions. The flexibility that had made the Wehrmacht effective was replaced by rigid control from the top. The impact became clear during subsequent operations. The 1942 summer offensive toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus was designed by Hitler personally. Professional military advice recommended concentrating on one objective. Hitler insisted on splitting forces to pursue both. The result was 6th Army's encirclement at Stalingrad and Army Group A's near encirclement in the Caucasus. Both disasters resulted from Hitler's refusal to choose priorities. At Stalingrad specifically, the pattern that began December 19, 1941, repeated with catastrophic consequences. 6th Army was encircled. Field Marshal Paulus requested permission to break out. Hitler forbade it. Professional military judgment said breakout was essential. Hitler insisted on holding. The Luftwaffe promised to supply the pocket by air. The promise proved impossible. 6th Army died slowly over 3 months. 250,000 men were killed or captured because Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal. This pattern repeated across the Eastern Front for the rest of the war. At Kursk in 1943, Hitler insisted on offensive operations despite warnings that Soviet defenses were too strong. The offensive failed with enormous losses. At Korsun in 1944, Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal until 2 corps were encircled. At the Crimea, at the Baltic states, at every crisis, the same dynamic played out. Field commanders requested authorization to retreat. Hitler refused until catastrophe forced it. Casualties were higher than necessary. The Western Front showed identical patterns after D-Day. Field Marshal Rommel and Field Marshal von Rundstedt both advised Hitler that holding the Normandy beaches was impossible. They recommended withdrawing to defensible lines inland where armor could be concentrated. Hitler insisted on holding every meter of coastline. When the Allied breakout came at St-Lo, German forces were positioned badly and took unnecessary casualties. The Officer Corps, which had accepted Hitler's assumption of command in December 1940, won with misgivings. Learned by 1944 that the situation was intolerable. A group of officers, including some who had been dismissed by Hitler, planned the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt. The bomb planted at Hitler's headquarters nearly succeeded. Hitler survived, and the subsequent purge killed thousands of officers suspected of involvement or insufficient loyalty. The failed assassination attempt made Hitler's control even more total. He trusted no one. Every decision, every order, every authorization now required his personal approval. Officers lived in fear of being associated with anything that could be construed as defeatism. The command system became paralyzed by fear and micromanagement. Germany was fighting a three-front war controlled by a man who trusted no one and made decisions based on ideological convictions rather than military reality. For individual soldiers, the consequences were direct and deadly. They held indefensible positions because Hitler ordered it. They died in encirclements that could have been avoided. They fought without adequate supplies because logistics were subordinated to Hitler's operational demands. They watched competent officers relieved for making sound tactical decisions that contradicted ideology. Morale suffered. Soldiers understood they were dying for no purpose other than delaying inevitable defeat. The generals who remained in command after December 1941 were either ideologically committed Nazis, weak-willed yes-men, or professionals who had learned to navigate Hitler's demands through careful manipulation. The most competent officers, those willing to provide honest assessments and argue for sound military decisions, were systematically removed. The Wehrmacht's leadership was purged of independent thinkers and replaced with compliant executors of Hitler's will. Comparing Germany's command structure to its enemies illustrates the dysfunction. The Soviet Union under Stalin had similar issues with political interference in military decisions, but after the disasters of 1940–42, Stalin learned to delegate operational control to professionals like Zhukov. Stalin set strategic objectives, but allowed military commanders to determine how to achieve them. Hitler never made this transition. He micromanaged operations until the end. Britain and America both maintained strict civilian control of military strategy, but allowed military professionals to handle operations. Churchill and Roosevelt set war aims and allocated resources, but didn't dictate tactical decisions. Eisenhower commanded D-Day operations with political guidance, but not political interference in operational details. The distinction between strategic guidance and operational control was maintained. Germany under Hitler collapsed these distinctions. He set strategy, designed operations, made tactical decisions, and sometimes even interfered with individual unit dispositions. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Hitler personally determined which roads specific divisions would use. This level of micromanagement was unprecedented and unworkable. It guaranteed that local commanders couldn't respond to changing situations without waiting for authorization from headquarters. The military consequences were severe, but the political consequences were equally significant. Hitler's assumption of army command meant he was personally responsible for every defeat. He couldn't blame generals for failures because he had removed generals from decision-making authority. Every retreat, every encirclement, every disaster was a result of his decisions. The psychological burden should have been crushing. Instead, Hitler blamed subordinates for failing to execute his perfect plans. This psychology explains much about the war's final phase. Hitler couldn't admit his strategies had failed because that meant admitting personal failure. He couldn't authorize retreats because retreat meant acknowledging mistake. He couldn't negotiate peace because that meant accepting defeat. His assumption of total military control meant he was trapped by his own decisions. Changing course meant admitting error, which was psychologically impossible. The result was continued prosecution of an unwinnable war long after rational calculation said negotiated settlement was necessary. By 1944, Germany faced enemies on all fronts with resources it couldn't match. Continuing the war meant progressive destruction of German military forces, infrastructure, and cities. But ending the war meant Hitler admitting the entire enterprise had failed. His ego couldn't permit that admission. So the war continued. Soldiers died holding positions with no strategic value because Hitler ordered it. Cities were destroyed in bombings that military resistance couldn't prevent. Refugees fled from Soviet advance that German forces couldn't stop. The final year of the war in Europe was extended catastrophe, killing millions, destroying nations, for no purpose other than Hitler's refusal to accept reality. When Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30, 1945, he still claimed he'd been betrayed by weak subordinates. He never acknowledged that his decisions had doomed Germany. The officer corps, what remained of it, understood. They had watched Hitler's leadership destroy the Wehrmacht. They had participated in that destruction because refusing orders meant death. They had survived by compromising their professional integrity, and Germany had been destroyed anyway. The historical assessment of December 19, 1941, is that it marked the beginning of Germany's military decline disguised as assumption of control. Hitler took personal command at the moment when professional military leadership was most necessary. The challenges of fighting multi-front war against enemies with superior resources required operational excellence and strategic flexibility. Hitler provided ideological rigidity and tactical micromanagement instead. The counterfactual question is whether professional military leadership could have changed Germany's fate. The answer is probably not. By December 1941, Germany was fighting enemies it couldn't defeat. Britain was unconquered. The Soviet Union hadn't collapsed. America's entry into the war guaranteed overwhelming resource disparity. No amount of operational excellence could overcome these strategic realities. But professional military leadership might have limited casualties and avoided catastrophes. The encirclement at Stalingrad could have been prevented. The Sixth Army didn't need to die. The disasters at Korsun, in the Crimea, in Normandy, all resulted from Hitler's refusal to authorize necessary withdrawals. Professional commanders would have conducted fighting retreats, preserving forces while yielding ground. The war would still have been lost, but millions of lives might have been saved. This is the tragedy of December 19, 1941. Hitler assumed total control at the moment when yielding control was necessary. He micromanaged operations when delegation was required. He made decisions based on ideology when reality demanded pragmatism. And because he controlled everything, no one could stop him until Soviet forces were in Berlin and American forces were across the Rhine. For the German soldiers who fought under Hitler's personal command, the experience was slow realization that they were led by a man who valued symbolic victories over their lives. The stands at Stalingrad, Kursk, Normandy, and countless smaller battles consumed soldiers for no strategic gain. The refusal to retreat meant men died holding tactically worthless positions. The micromanagement meant local commanders couldn't respond to crises without waiting for authorization that came too late or not at all. The officers who survived the war and wrote memoirs almost universally blamed Hitler for Germany's defeat. This was partially self-serving, shifting responsibility from their own participation. But it was also accurate. Hitler's assumption of army command created command structure that couldn't function effectively. His refusal to accept reality made rational strategy impossible. His micromanagement paralyzed operational flexibility. Germany would have lost the war anyway. Hitler's personal command ensured the loss was more complete and costly than necessary. December 19, 1941, was the day one man's ego took control of an entire nation's military. It was the day professional judgment was subordinated to ideological fanaticism. It was the day Germany's fate was sealed, not by enemy action, but by its own leaders' delusions. The soldiers who died under Hitler's command deserved better leadership. The officers who were dismissed for providing honest assessments deserved respect rather than punishment. And Germany, as a nation, deserved strategic direction that recognized reality rather than fantasy. But none of that happened. Hitler took total control. He held it until his death, and under his personal command, Germany fought itself to destruction. The decision made on December 19, 1941, in a concrete bunker in East Prussia, determined how 3.5 more years of war would be conducted. Professional military leadership was replaced by one man's will. And that will, untempered by reality or moderated by professional advice, led Germany to absolute catastrophe.